The moment I opened the front door, I knew something was wrong. I had been gone overseas for nearly 6 months, and I had expected to find the apartment exactly as I left it, quiet, ordinary, maybe a little dusty. Instead, before I could even put my suitcase down, my roommate came running down the hallway, threw her arms around me, buried her face against my chest, and held on so tightly that I could barely breathe. She was crying so hard her whole body trembled, and when I tried to pull back to see what had happened, she only held me tighter, as if letting go would make me disappear again. I had come home 2 weeks earlier than planned because the project I was working on overseas had suddenly ended, and I had imagined surprising her with a laugh and a cup of coffee. I never imagined that my surprise would uncover a secret she had been carrying alone for months. If you believe in kindness, forgiveness, hope, and second chances, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, share this story with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so we can keep sharing stories that remind us how deeply one person can matter to another. My name is Callum Reed, and before I left for my overseas assignment, my life had felt painfully predictable. I was 32, worked as a structural engineer, and had recently accepted a temporary position with an international construction firm. The assignment was supposed to last 6 months, and although I had initially been excited about the opportunity, leaving home became harder than I expected. My roommate, Margot Ellis, had been living with me for almost 3 years. We weren't a couple, although strangers often assumed we were because of how comfortable we were around each other. We had met through a mutual friend after both of us had gone through difficult periods in our lives, and somehow, over time, the apartment stopped feeling like a place we rented and became a home we built together. Margot was the kind of person who remembered tiny things about people. She knew how I liked my coffee, which songs I played when I was stressed, and exactly how quiet I became when something was bothering me. I knew that she always pretended to be stronger than she felt and that whenever life frightened her, she cleaned the kitchen until every surface shone. We had developed an unspoken friendship that neither of us had ever bothered to define. The morning I left for the airport, Margot had stood beside my suitcase pretending she wasn't emotional. She had teased me about packing too many shirts and reminded me that I would probably forget something important. I remember smiling because I thought she was simply nervous about living alone for a few months. Before I walked out, I promised her I would call whenever I could. She made me promise something else too, although at the time I didn't understand why. She asked me not to disappear into my new life and forget the people waiting for me back home. I laughed and told her that 6 months wasn't long enough to forget anyone. Then I left, completely unaware that those words would eventually come back to me with a weight I couldn't have imagined. The first few months overseas were exhausting. My days were consumed by construction meetings, inspections, deadlines, unfamiliar streets, and constant pressure to prove myself. Margot and I exchanged messages almost every day at first. Then the messages became less frequent. She told me she was busy. I told her I was busy. Whenever I called, she sounded cheerful, but there was something different in her voice. I assumed she was lonely. I assumed she was adjusting. I assumed many things because assumptions were easier than admitting that I missed her more than I wanted to admit. I had always believed that missing someone meant wanting them beside you, but with Margot, it felt more complicated. I missed the ordinary things. Her footsteps in the hallway. Her ridiculous habit of leaving a book open on the kitchen table. The way she would ask if I had eaten whenever I sounded tired. I began to realize that home wasn't the apartment itself. Home was the person who made the silence feel less empty. Then, about 2 weeks before I was scheduled to return, everything changed. The company canceled the final phase of my assignment after a major contract was postponed. I was given the choice of staying overseas and helping with administrative work or returning home early. I didn't hesitate. I booked the earliest flight I could find. I didn't tell Margot because I wanted to surprise her. During the long journey back, I imagined her reaction. I pictured her opening the door, staring at me in disbelief, and then laughing. I even bought her favorite pastries at the airport. I had no idea that the woman who would open that door would not be the same Margot I remembered. When I finally arrived at the apartment, it was late morning. Sunlight poured through the windows, and for a few seconds everything looked normal. My key still worked. The small plant Margot had nearly killed twice was somehow alive. Her shoes were beside the stairs. A grocery list was stuck to the refrigerator. I smiled as I stepped inside, expecting to hear music from the living room. Instead, the apartment was completely silent. I called her name softly, and seconds later I heard hurried footsteps. Margot appeared at the end of the hallway. She froze when she saw me. Her face went completely pale. Then she ran. She didn't say anything. She simply crashed into me and wrapped both arms around my shoulders. I dropped the pastry bag, and my suitcase tipped over beside us. She held me as if she had been waiting months for that exact moment, and then she began crying. Not quiet tears. Not the kind people wipe away while pretending they're fine. These were deep, uncontrollable sobs that seemed to come from somewhere she had been hiding for a very long time. I tried to ask what was wrong, but she couldn't answer. She only shook her head and held me tighter. I remember feeling confused, frightened, and strangely heartbroken all at once. Whatever had happened while I was gone, Margot had been carrying it alone. Eventually, she pulled away and wiped her face. She looked embarrassed, almost ashamed, and I noticed something I hadn't seen before. She had lost weight. There were dark circles beneath her eyes. Her usually organized hair was pulled into a careless knot, and the sleeves of her sweater covered her hands as though she wanted to hide inside it. I asked her whether someone had hurt her. She said no. I asked whether she was sick. Again, she shook her head. Finally, I asked the question that seemed to frighten her most, whether something had happened while I was away. She stared at the floor for several seconds before admitting that there had been a problem with the apartment, a problem involving money, and another problem involving someone she trusted. She tried to minimize everything, but I knew her too well. Margot had always believed that needing help was a form of failure. As she slowly explained what had happened, the pieces began to fit together. A few months after I left, she had been laid off from her job after the company she worked for downsized unexpectedly. She had applied everywhere, but the job market was brutal. She used her savings to keep paying her share of the rent and utilities, determined not to burden me while I was overseas. When her savings began disappearing, she took temporary work during the day and cleaned offices in the afternoons. She was exhausted, but she refused to tell me because she knew how much pressure I was under. Then came the betrayal. A former friend had convinced her to lend money for what sounded like a legitimate business opportunity. Margot had trusted her and handed over almost everything she had left. The money disappeared. So did the friend. Margot was left with rent due, almost no savings, and a growing fear that she might lose the apartment. She had considered telling me, but every time she reached for her phone, she remembered the promise she had made before I left. She didn't want to become the person who called me overseas because she couldn't manage her own life. I was angry, but not at Margot. I was angry that she had been struggling alone while I had been thousands of miles away believing she was fine. I was angry that pride had convinced her she had to suffer silently. Most of all, I was angry at myself for not noticing the changes in her messages. She had given me dozens of chances to ask deeper questions, and I had accepted every cheerful answer because it was easier for me. But then she told me something that stopped me completely. She said the hardest part hadn't been losing the money or nearly losing the apartment. The hardest part had been believing that if she admitted she was struggling, I would look at her differently. She had spent months convincing herself that she was only my roommate, that she had no right to depend on me, and that eventually I would return, see how much trouble she had caused, and decide I didn't want her in my life anymore. That was why she had run into my arms when I came home. Not because she wanted rescuing. Not because she wanted money. She had simply reached the point where she couldn't pretend anymore. seeing me standing in the doorway had broken through the wall she had built around herself. I told her what I should have told her months earlier, that friendship was never supposed to be a transaction. She didn't have to earn her place in my life by being strong every day. She didn't have to hide her pain to deserve kindness. I reminded her of all the times she had helped me without expecting anything in return. When I had lost my father, she had quietly handled groceries and meals because she knew I couldn't think about basic things. When I had failed an important professional exam, she had stayed up with me while I studied for the retake. When I doubted myself, she had reminded me of who I was. She had never once asked me to prove that I deserved her friendship. Why should she have to prove herself to me? That afternoon, we sat together at the kitchen table and went through everything. We calculated the bills, reviewed her remaining savings, and made a plan. I helped cover the immediate expenses, but more importantly, I helped her understand that accepting temporary support wasn't weakness. Margot eventually found another job through a former colleague, and I helped her rebuild her savings gradually. But the biggest change wasn't financial. It was emotional. She stopped apologizing every time she needed something. She began saying when she was tired. She began asking for help before reaching a breaking point. And I learned something too. I learned that loving someone, whether as a friend, family member, or partner, isn't simply about being there when everything is beautiful. It's about paying attention when someone says they're fine but their eyes are telling you something else. Weeks passed, and life slowly became ordinary again. We cooked together. We argued over whose turn it was to buy groceries. We laughed about the ridiculous things that had happened while I was away. One afternoon, while we were sitting on the balcony drinking coffee, Margot admitted that she had been terrified when I came home early. She thought I would see the truth and leave. Instead, I had seen the truth and stayed. I told her that coming home early had been the luckiest accident of my life. If my assignment had continued as planned, I might have returned 2 weeks later and never known how close she had been to breaking. I might have missed the chance to remind someone I cared about that she didn't have to face everything alone. Months later, Margot received a promotion at her new job. She came home carrying a small box of pastries and placed them on the kitchen counter. She was smiling so brightly that I knew something wonderful had happened before she even told me. We celebrated that afternoon with cheap coffee, homemade sandwiches, and the kind of laughter that makes your stomach hurt. Nothing about the celebration was extravagant. There were no fancy restaurants or expensive gifts. But there was something more valuable in that room. Two people who had survived a difficult season and learned that asking for help did not make either of them less worthy. Before the end of that year, Margot moved into her own apartment. It was a bittersweet day. We carried boxes down the stairs together, laughing about how much useless stuff we had accumulated. When her last box was loaded into the car, she stood in the doorway for a long moment. She hugged me again, but this time there was no desperation in it. There were no tears of fear. It was simply the embrace of someone saying goodbye to a chapter of her life while knowing the friendship would continue. As I watched her drive away that afternoon, I realized that sometimes people enter our lives as roommates, co-workers, neighbors, or strangers, and somewhere along the way they quietly become family. We don't always recognize the moment it happens. There is no announcement. No dramatic promise. It happens through ordinary mornings, shared meals, difficult conversations, and the countless small acts of kindness nobody else notices. Margot had once been afraid that needing me would make her a burden. Instead, allowing herself to be vulnerable gave both of us something we had been missing, the courage to be honest with each other. I had returned from overseas 2 weeks early expecting to surprise my roommate. Instead, I came home just in time to remind a person I loved that she was never alone. And perhaps that was the real surprise waiting for me behind that front door. I thought I was coming home to an apartment. I discovered I was coming home to someone who had been quietly holding a place for me in her heart the entire time. Before we end, I want you to think about one question and leave your answer in the comments. Have you ever stayed silent about your struggles because you were afraid of becoming a burden to someone you loved? And if someone you care about is always saying they are fine, maybe today is the day to ask them one more time and truly listen to the answer. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. Sometimes the people who seem strongest are the ones quietly hoping someone will notice they need a hand. Sometimes coming home means more than returning to a place. It means finding the people who remind us that we belong. And sometimes, the greatest gift we can give another human being is simply this, the reassurance that they never have to carry everything alone. For a while after Margot moved into her own apartment, I thought the hardest part of our story was behind us. We had survived the financial crisis, the betrayal, the fear, and the uncomfortable truth that both of us had been hiding behind our own versions of strength. But life has a strange way of showing us that healing doesn't always mean the story is finished. Sometimes, just when you think everything has finally settled, another moment arrives that forces you to confront the feelings you thought you had already understood. About 3 months after Margot moved out, I received a message from her one Saturday morning. It wasn't unusual for us to talk, but the message itself was different. She asked if I could meet her for coffee that afternoon. She didn't explain why. Normally, Margot would have added a dozen details, but this time there were only a few simple words. I immediately knew something was wrong. When we met at a small cafe near her apartment, she was already sitting by the window. She looked different from the woman I had seen during those difficult months. Her hair was neatly styled, her posture was confident, and there was a calmness in her face that hadn't been there before. But when she saw me, that familiar nervous smile appeared. She moved her cup aside and asked me to sit down. For several minutes, neither of us said much. We talked about ordinary things. Her new job was going well. My company had offered me another overseas assignment, although this time it would only last 3 months. She asked whether I was going to accept it. I told her I hadn't decided yet. Then she became quiet. Eventually, she admitted that she had been thinking about something ever since the day I came home early. She had spent months believing that she needed to become completely independent before she could feel proud of herself. But after moving out, she realized independence wasn't about refusing help. It was about knowing you could stand on your own while still allowing people to stand beside you. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope. Inside was a photograph of the two of us from the day I returned home. Neither of us had known someone had taken it. We were standing in the hallway, her arms around me, my suitcase lying on the floor beside us. Her face was buried against my shoulder, and my expression looked completely stunned. She told me she had kept the photograph because it reminded her of the exact moment she stopped pretending she was okay. I smiled and told her that, from my perspective, it was the moment I finally understood how much she meant to me. She looked down at the photograph for a long time. Then she admitted something that made the entire cafe seem strangely quiet. She said she had been afraid that our friendship meant more to her than it did to me. I didn't know what to say at first. Not because the idea surprised me, but because I had secretly wondered the same thing about myself. For years, I had carefully avoided giving our relationship a name. Calling Margot my roommate was easy. Calling her my best friend was accurate, but somehow still incomplete. She had become the person I looked for when something good happened and the person I wanted nearby when something went wrong. When I traveled, she was the person I wanted to tell about the view outside my hotel window. When I returned home, she was the person I expected to see first. When she moved out, my apartment suddenly felt much larger and much emptier. The truth was that I had spent years convincing myself that what I felt was simply friendship because friendship felt safe. Love felt frightening. Margot finally looked up at me and said that she wasn't asking me for anything. She wasn't trying to change our friendship. She simply didn't want either of us to keep hiding behind fear. That sentence stayed with me. I had always believed courage meant doing something dramatic. taking a dangerous job, traveling across the world, standing in front of hundreds of people, making difficult decisions. But sitting across from Margot that afternoon, I realized courage could be much quieter. Sometimes courage was simply telling the truth to someone who mattered. I told her that when I came home early, I had expected to miss the life I had built overseas. Instead, the first thing I felt when I saw her was relief. And when she ran into my arms, something inside me had finally stopped fighting the truth. I cared about her more deeply than I had allowed myself to admit. Her eyes filled with tears, but she smiled. There was no dramatic kiss, no perfect movie moment, and no sudden transformation. Instead, there was something much more meaningful. There were two people sitting across from each other, finally telling the truth after years of pretending they didn't know it. We left the cafe that afternoon and walked through the neighborhood beneath the bright afternoon sun. We talked for hours. We remembered the first day we met, the terrible meals we had cooked together, the arguments over laundry, the birthdays we had forgotten, and all the tiny moments that had quietly transformed two strangers into family. Over the following months, we didn't rush anything. We continued learning what our relationship meant. There were awkward conversations, moments of uncertainty, and days when one of us became afraid and pulled back. But this time, we didn't disappear behind silence. We talked. That became the greatest change between us. Before, we had both believed that protecting someone meant hiding our problems from them. Now we understood that sometimes honesty was the greatest form of protection. When my company eventually asked me to accept another overseas assignment, I knew exactly what I had to do. I didn't automatically say yes. I didn't automatically say no. I went home and talked to Margot. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where we had once calculated bills and tried to repair a life that seemed to be falling apart. This time, we weren't talking about debt or fear. We were talking about our future. Margot encouraged me to take the opportunity if it mattered to me. But she also made me promise that I wouldn't disappear into work again. I smiled because I remembered the promise she had made me before I left the first time. She had once asked me not to disappear into my new life and forget the people waiting for me back home. Now I finally understood